Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am Templar, and today we are actually going to talk about the history of crucifixions, or the different types of crucifixions throughout in history. Now, this idea came to me because of Easter Sunday. Now, due to past Easter Sunday, I decided might as well actually start talking about this. Now, this type of form in history is kind of well left untalked about, and as well, many times over, there are different forms of crucifixions. In fact, when we think of the forms of crucifixions today, we technically think of only one form, and that would be of Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus Christ, and in doing so, the way he was crucified. However, there are many thousands of ways that people were actually crucified. However, we today only know a few couple. Now, these are technically viewed by many forms in history. For example, we know the most logical one, as we all know, is how Jesus would have, or Jesus of Nazareth would have pretty much been crucified. In the process, he would have actually been crucified upon a said cross-like object. However, there are actually two forms out of which it would have been looked like, a lowercase t and a capital T design shape. However, this is not just the only one. In fact, throughout history there have actually been a number of versions to this design. For example, there is the St. Andrew's cross, that of which is technically on many flags to this day, especially on the flag of Scotland, and as well including many others, as well the Confederate flag, and as well Jamaica, and a couple of others that have been recently forgotten, such as even Alabama, or including even the former Spanish flag, for example. However, this symbol here, as we can actually understand, is actually a good example of it. For example, if we think about it, the X shape is the design for it, of which is how many people remember St. Andrew's cross. However, that's the thing. St. Andrew's cross is not just the only version. In fact, there have been many versions of the cross or crucifix. One of them in popular form would actually be the most famous, would actually have been the, well, as we stated, the lowercase or capital case T. However, there have actually been other versions, such as the so-called Greek version, of which was stated to have been an X-shaped type of frame with a middle frame holding the said cross in the place. This, though, was actually in a type of angle, so many people state that this is not a crucifixion. However, it technically is. Now, this type of design is actually what later on would be known as the X-shaped form of crucifixions. However, it is stated, though, that crucifixions, as we know of today, is a lot different. In fact, back then, crucifixions, as we think, were, well, of like this image here of Christ being crucified. However, it's actually stated the way Christ was crucified was a lot different compared to what we think. Now, how do I mean by that? Well, it's kind of like this. If we were to take a look at history books, it actually does show something a little bit different, and as well, it describes something else differently. For example, if we take a look at this image, it shows as though Christ's hands, including his feet, have been nailed. But in truth, it would actually be a lot different. For example, if we take a look at the said human bones from the said foot, we actually do see that the foot would not be the most ideological place to place a nail. In truth, the most best and perfect place would actually have been in the Achilles tendon, or in this case, the heel, as you can see in this image right here. Now, I heard you already, but Templar, why put it in the heel? Well, here's the kind of obvious term for it. The reason why putting them in the heel form is kind of obvious because of the fact if you nail the heel in the process, it has more bone marrow than it does in the foot. Which in the process, if you were to actually say, well, get that problem in the first place, most of your entire foot is mostly of muscle tissue and with less bone marrow design in there. Meaning that if you were to actually nail a foot, your foot might in the process tear due to the fact of the gravitational pull. So, yeah. Now, how about the nails in the wrists or the hands? Was that actually how it was? Well, it's actually stated that the nails would have actually gone into the wrists, not the hands. Of which many scholars are actually discovering or rediscovering that sometimes there have actually been multiple forms of nails, sometimes in the wrist, hands, or somewhere else. However, in this image, as you can see, the person's hands are actually, or his arms are actually binded by rope, and as well his heels are actually nailed, which gives us a good description of what it might have really looked like most of the time. However, that's one thing explaining it. For example, there have been, as I stated before, multiple versions of crucifixions. Now, that's actually explaining something, but crucifixions itself have a different form in there. Now, how was Christ crucified, you might ask? Well, it's actually stated that Jesus of Nazareth was actually crucified in the form of either a capital or lowercase t. We still don't know to this day which one it might have been. However, it is stated, though, that the way it might have been done is that he would have actually carried a elongated pole, not the entire cross itself. Now, how and why would this be done? Well, this kind of actually explains something. In fact, many people were actually had their arms bound to the said beam, that of which their hands would have been crucified upon. Now, what does that mean? Well, here's the thing. If you take a look at at the capital T, for example, you can actually see that it looks almost as though that it can actually be removed. That's because it was. In fact, this is technically seen with most crucifixions, of which is kind of why it was known like this. In fact, many of these crucifixions were done with a capital T. However, with Christ, though, it might have actually been a type of nailed system. In other words, he could have probably been hoisted up there in the process. However, as I stated before, there are hundreds of ways that might have been done. So, either it was with a lowercase t or a capital T is still unknown. However, though, we do know for the fact he wasn't crucified on a tree. Yeah, sorry for any Christian believers that believe he was crucified on a tree. That actually, idealism hasn't actually been used in any part of the Middle East due to the fact that the trees at the time were a lot different compared to our modern day. How so? Well, it's kind of obvious. Many of the trees that are actually used in the Middle East were extremely smaller back then than they are today. However, the types of trees that we think that might have been used would have probably been a palm tree. However, that's kind of unlikely due to the fact the supposed idealism of using a palm tree as a crucifixion piece is a lot different. Now, here's the thing though. There is a type of crucifixion known as the beam. Now, what is the beam? The beam is technically of something like this. In fact, their body would have actually been nailed upon a type of post or beam, and in which a lot of people actually do believe that this is another version of how Christ was crucified. However, it's still left unknown to this day. Now, though, this is actually a really good one to bring up, because this one is actually been used in history books. Now, here's the thing, though. Let me first start with the basis form. Crucifixions did not start by the Romans. These actually first started by the Greeks, and of which the Greeks' crucifixion were actually either with the beam or with the X-shaped cross, or the type of Greek cross and, well, beam pole, and of which this type of design was technically used by them, and you could see why. However, it evolved because of the Romans who got their hands on it. Now, though, that's the thing, though. This form of crucifixion with the beam was a lot different than what we think. How so? Well, their hands would have just been crucified, not their feet. In doing so, if they were crucified, say, upside down, it would have been their feet. So, you could see where their nail would have actually gone. This was a lot different and a lot more gruesome. In doing so, sometimes even their hands and wrists were nailed on the very top end of the said beam. However, this to this day is still unknown. Now, here is an image from the series Game of Thrones, of which we can actually see the fact of a flailed man being crucified. Now that actually does give a good example of the said forms of the upside down cross. Now, here's the thing though, I'm pretty much putting this image here to explain my point. That many Catholics kind of view the upside down cross as the end of days, while many other forms of Christians actually view the upside down cross as a form of satanic worship. Which is kind of hilarious to the fact, because here's the thing. The so-called form of upside-down cross is not the symbol of the Antichrist. It's technically an ancient symbol that was technically showing the form that Christ returned. And as well, many martyrs actually refused to be crucified in the form of Jesus Christ. One of them would actually be St. Peter himself, who stated that he will not be crucified in the way and manner of his Savior. In doing so, he was crucified upside down. This type of form was also extremely gruesome. And as well, we can actually see this imagery here of actually the form of what you might call, well, the Vatican City with a keyhole and an upside down cross, showing the form of actually the so-called paradise to heaven. Now, though, that's the thing. This type of form of crucifixion was incredibly gruesome also. Now, that's the thing. There were different forms of crucifixions throughout history. Now, that's hard to explain though. But the one that we actually do understand though, that the forms of crucifixion were actually gruesome, it's actually stated the Romans actually used either the lower or capital T for a form of crucifixion, while the Greeks would have used either the X shape or including the beam most of the time. However, it is stated though that the Romans actually did copy and use the X-shaped beam later on down the line. But, however, because of their forms of crucifixion, it's actually stated that later on their Roman enemies, or the enemies of Rome, actually copied from their enemies and actually crucified their enemies in the forests of Germania. This would have actually been done by the Germanic Celts, or the Germanic Norse people, who of which actually were stated to have been pretty ritualistic of human sacrifice. And of which, if we think about this in history, this is actually where the humans being crucified on a tree would have actually come from. In truth, this is actually where the full form of a human crucifixion on a tree was actually seen. Now, though, that's only some part about it. In fact, it's actually stated that most humans were actually crucified, and then in the process, their guts were ripped out of their internal stomachs, and in the process, wrapped around the tree. We don't know if that's true or not, but it's just a little bit of a gory detail. Now, however, there actually have been a type of forms in history, such as by the fall of the Roman Empire. It's actually stated, or technically by the fall of the Western Roman Empire, I should say, it's actually stated that the Romans actually kind of got their information copied off again, this time used by other cultures, mainly the Norse Vikings. Now, in doing so, they would have actually crucified the said person, but not in the type of way we think of today. In fact, it's actually stated that when they crucified a said Saxon, Celt, or even a Frankish person, it's actually stated that the Norse Vikings actually were stated to have actually crucified their victims actually in a weird form. Instead of the person facing outward from the cross, he was actually facing inward to the cross. Meaning his face was actually, and stomach and chest were actually on the cross itself, not his back. This way, the said Norsemen can actually do the blood eagle ritual. Now, if y'all don't know what that is, it's actually ripping open the spinal back area, and in the process, pulling out the lungs and such, and including, in the process, making it look as though the folded wings of a said, eagle. Now, this is kind of very gory as we think of it today, but the thing is, that is kind of the ancient ritual that they would have done. Now, however, it's actually stated that the crucifixions would have actually still been used by many people during the time, especially by crusaders against their own people that have actually committed crimes. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of obvious. If someone was to commit a crime, a very serious crime, it was stated that he was nailed to a post, especially in the middle of a downtown square. Say, for example, like, I am a convicted villain who in the process committed murder, theft, and all that such, and in the process, here's the thing, I'm now being held by the police, and in the process, I'm being nailed to a small cross in the middle of downtown. Now, this cross, however, is not exactly like what we would see from crucifixions during the early years. In fact, these were technically very small. In fact, you would actually be kneeling down while, in the process, your feet would be nailed into the said stake in the ground. Now, it's still, as I stated before, this is clearly gruesome. In fact, this type of form of crucifixion kept on lasting up until the colonial period, of which was then brought back by the British Army. In fact, it was stated that the British Army had actually started to crucify many Scots before the Jacobite uprising, and of which this actually caused many Scots to later on rebel. In fact, they actually were stated to have actually done crucifixions in the X-shaped form, and as well, the persons would later on die. However, it's even stated that crucifixions were not just seen by European powers, but also by Asian powers, mainly by Japan. In fact, it was stated that Japanese culture had actually crucified many other people who actually committed barbaric sins and as well horrendous killings. In fact, it's actually been seen when a crime was committed by a said group of said thieves who in the process killed their masters and as well in the process tried to steal from their belongings. They were later on caught, beheaded, and as well crucified, of which kind of gives a good example to it. However, this form of crucifixion still kept on going. In fact, it's actually stated that Japanese kept doing this up until World War II, of which they actually were stated to have committed war crimes just like this during World War against many POWs, mainly Americans. For example, during World War I, it was actually stated a Canadian soldier actually was crucified to a barn by German soldiers. However, many historians actually state this might have been a myth just to make the Huns look bad, or Germans look bad as I should say. However, we still don't know if this was true or not, in which it's still kind of hard to understand. Now, another form of Japanese crucifixion could actually be seen on the water. In fact, this image here, as we can see, this image actually shows soldiers, or in the process of convicted villains, actually have been crucified upside down in the waterline. In the process, when the tide comes in, they drown and die. However, this is actually only one form to it. Now, as I stated before, crucifixions like this are incredibly gruesome. And in doing so, sometimes during World War I and II, a couple of soldiers actually had been crucified by barbed wire and shrapnel. Now, how can this be done, you might ask? Here's the thing, somehow in the process during World War I, another Canadian soldier had actually been crucified mainly because an explosion threw him from his said position, and in the process, he was actually crucified from nails from the ladders, and including barbed wire that wrapped around his body. In the process, he was crucified upon a said tree limb. Which, yeah, sounds gruesome as much as it sounds. However, that's only one form. In fact, during World War II, or before World War II, it was also stated that many Jews were actually crucified by Nazi collaborators, and as well many people in Italy were also being crucified by Benito Mussolini's regime, which is kind of gruesome still to this day. However, that's only what we actually understand. Now, it's actually stated, though, crucifixions have actually been seen throughout the said known world, and of which have actually been brought into light because of both the Greeks and Romans. However, were actually popularized by the Romans, who kind of overdid it with their crucifixions, if you ask me. In fact, they technically crucified a person for every single crime there was. If you stole something, it was crucifixion. If you murdered someone, it was crucifixion. If you lied somehow, it was a crucifixion. Which, yeah, I know, it's kind of weird with the Romans, if you ask me. But the most popular ones that we actually know of would actually be either with a capital or lowercase t. However, the X-shaped cross can actually be seen in many flags also. In fact, these type of forms of crucifixions have actually been seen throughout history. However, the most probably gruesome one I could probably ever talk about would actually have to be the one that would either be the one with the nailing to the tree in Germanic culture, or the one with the post. Either way, if y'all actually find this helpful, let me know in the comments below. Find out and let me know of which one was actually more gruesome for y'all. Anyways, guys, let me know in the comments below if y'all want me to talk any more about this, and as well if y'all want me to talk about any subject in history. Also, let me know in the comments below, and I will be happy to talk about it as soon as possible. Anyways, guys, it's been Templar. Have a great day. Also, click that bell button for notifications, and as well subscribe to the channel to help the channel grow, and also check out our Facebook. Anyways, guys, it's been Templar. Have a great day.